So we opened up our canopies as planned at 3,500 feet. And with, you're free falling. So you come in, you open your canopy, you go back to that position real quick, your canopy opens within a couple of seconds. And at that point, there was another jumper still above me in free fall. You're falling at 120 miles an hour. He saw my chute. He balled up in a cannonball position instinctively. He's protecting himself. And that,
which would cause him to accelerate because the momentum.
And so that collision destroyed my parachute, shattered my skull, and knocked me unconscious. So I streamered with that. A couple of cells remained open, and I streamered in a controllable violent spin, unconscious for about 3,000 feet. They estimate 100 miles an hour hitting the ground. I don't remember any of that. That's into my unconscious world. Although at that point, my soul, my consciousness was leaving my body.
Welcome. I'm here with Scott Gearen. Scott, welcome.
Hi. Thank you. Glad to be here, Sean.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm glad that a mutual friend, Jeff, made the connection because I think you have a lot to add. So I think on this first particular video interview with you, we're going to talk about your, highly distinguished military career. So much so that I think you inspired David Goggins. It's pretty, just crazy. So it just very briefly, just a little bit about your background, and then I think we can start walking through your military career. Just some of the highlights that I want to mention. You were at Bentwaters in 1980 when the incident happened, right? I don't think you...
At Woodbridge.
Woodbridge. And then, but you weren't involved in it at all. But, and we'll get into that in the next episode. But I think there's a lot of interesting pieces about your career that you were in kind of certain places at the right time. It's kind of odd in some sense. But anyway, I will stop talking. Just a little bit about yourself. Where you're from? Why did you go into the Air Force?
I grew up in Florida, down in Tampa Bay area. Back then, it was really at the 1960s, so it was a lot less crowded. You could still drive down the road and see the beach instead of hotels and condominiums. So it was really nice then growing up. High school, attempted junior college. I didn't care for it. And a friend suggested we go in, see a recruiter, and saw an Air Force recruiter. Didn't really know anything about the Air Force, and everybody in it must fly jets, and found out that it wasn't really how it was. And so looked through a list of jobs and saw one called Pararescue, and I'd always wanted to jump out of airplanes, and so we used to go over to Zephyr Hills back then, watch parachutists, early days jumping with everybody had round canopies, and saw this job called Pararescue. Saw a young man in an airplane, full scuba gear, scuba tanks on his back, a parachute on top of the scuba tanks, and he jumps out of a C-130, lands in the water, opens up a little life raft and climbs in it. And I was like, all right, I'm hooked. Stop the video. That's what I want to do. So I enlisted at that time and went through a Pararescue indoctrination course. It was about a 2-month course at that time at Lackland Air Force Base, and then into the pipeline, which they called it the pipeline, which consisted of other specialty schools, jump school, Fort Benning, scuba school, it's Key West Special Forces School, survival school, Fairchild Air Force Base, and then back to Kirtland Air Force Base.
Was survival school, was that SEER?
That was SEER. Back then it wasn't, it was just known as survival school mostly. SEER developed a little bit more. And as far as when I went to SEER, I went to the Army SEER school in, I think, 83. Nick Rowe was the commandant at that time, which was very exciting to meet him and him tell his story. He wrote his book, 5 Years to Freedom, when he was captured. And so he was the commandant, and he actually went back as the commandant and said, because he'd gotten out of the Army and came back in and said, I'll do this if you let me run it the way I want to in a realistic manner. And so it was very realistic as far as going through SEER school then.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Bain Books at bain.com.
So then I get back up, then from my own pipeline, we ended up at Kirtland, where we had medical skills training. It wasn't as intensive then as the national level EMT and paramedic course as it is now and has been for the last 20 and 30 years. We did more parachute operations, field survival, and both weapons training, and the field survival meaning two parts of it where we were in the field to learn the rope rescue techniques and situations if we found ourselves in that environment to rescue someone, and also the survival aspect of it. Parachute operations, we practiced jumping into the lake. It was a big lake. I can't think of the name. Elephant Butte, south of the base there. And then we went on to different parts of the country, forest. I think the Santa Fe National Forest was one of them in Florida. Practiced jumping into trees.
You got to tell me about that. Jumping into trees. That doesn't sound safe. It sounds like lots of broken legs and like
that happened. Yeah. So, with the Air Force pararescue teams that are out there, you are going to be called on for rescues in places that are mountainous, deserts, oceans, jungles. If an airplane pilots crash on base, you're going to call the local fire rescue or services, ambulance, and they can drive up there. And, not that it's an easy rescue, it's certainly challenging and difficult, but it's not like the middle of the ocean, or the middle of a jungle. And you can say Vietnam, for example, the jungle had layers to it. You had the lower brush that got very little sunlight, and then a little bit higher trees. And then eventually you'd have another layer of trees that would top out and get the sun. So you may have trees that are 200 plus or minus feet tall. And was it called Triple Canopy? There was actually a company called Triple Canopy, and that was started by some SF.
Yeah, they were a private military contractor, right? Triple Canopy.
Yeah, they were a contractor, yes, contract company. And I did work for Triple Canopy for a while. And so if you jumped into those trees, your hang up is going to be up at the top. And if you're hanging there, you've got 100 feet or so between you and the ground. You don't want to just fall out, and you're going to get injured. So what we had was like a nylon suit, looked like kind of the Michelin Man suit that you had on, and then you had Velcro siding strap sewn into the interior of it, and you had foam pads that would attach by Velcro to these certain areas, the vital areas, your knees, your groin, your back, shoulders area, your waist. And you had a large pocket on the side of your lower leg, and you would roll up bird nest like tubular nylon, and on the end of that you would have a connector snap, just like you would if you were doing a static line jump. So when you're hanging in the tree, you unhook this connector strap because you have it available on your body, and you route it through a couple of buckles that were on your suit that you were wearing, and then you would route it through each of the risers because as it comes up from your parachute, you have your risers that come up, and then they connect to the 550 cord. So you would route it through the risers a couple of times and then connect it back on itself. So now it's basically like you have a rope that's connected to a rock, some type of a anchor point. And then you would pop your cape wells, and now you're just hanging on
you rappel down the trees?
And then just rappel down from there. And your line is in your pocket, and you've got it coiled in such a way that it's going to come out without knotting. And then you would just rappel down to the ground. And so some of those techniques would go back to the smoke jumpers, back in the day, that would jump into forests to fight the forest fires. And then if you could find yourself on a mountain or in a jungle, and those are the type of conditions that you would be jumping into to save somebody.
Do they still do this training?
Don't do the training so much exactly like that. We've got parachutes that are much more maneuverable, and if you had to, you still could. The techniques are still there on how to do it, but not so much the training. And the pararescue itself goes back to the first mission, so to speak. It was in the China-Burma border. A CH-47 or a C-47, not a helicopter, but a fixed-wing C-47 went down on the China-Burma border in like 1942 or 43. There was like 21 people on board. I think one person ended up dying, but after a search, 3 or 4 hours, they finally located the crash site. And there was no way to get to it other than jumping. So you had a flight surgeon and 2 medics volunteered to jump in. And so that was kind of, eye-opener for Air Force officials about rescue and its capabilities, and other people that had the foresight to develop pararescue. But that's generally traced back to the first mission. And it wasn't even the Air Force then. It was still the Army Air Force.
Well, there was no Air Force then. It was the Army Air Corps, right?
Yeah. And so, a lot of the first people in pararescue, once in 1947, came over from the Army. There's several of the senior elders in pararescue that, were given the opportunity. Hey, you want to do this from the Army? And they said, yeah, sure, and left the Army and helped develop it in the Air Force.
All right. Sorry for the digression.
That's all right.
Sean.
Sorry.
All right. So you did, kind of training on how to jump into forests, et cetera. And then what?
And you're talking about injuries. We did have one of the guys in my class broke his leg, and several classes each after that, there was injuries. And so eventually they did stop that training because guys were just getting injured. Some were unable to continue in training, but they were too bad. And some were set back for a few months to heal. As far as then, so, that was about 1.5 years of training at that time. And I left there. My first assignment was to England for 67th ARRS at the time, Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron. And it was on Woodbridge. Woodbridge and Bentwaters were in Suffolk, probably about 80 miles north of London, right there on the coastline of the North Sea. And they were separated. The 2 runways in a straight line were only a couple of miles apart. I mean, if you were driving all the little curvy roads, take you a few miles to get there. But it was kind of like Rendlesham Forest, primarily separating the 2 because it was such a large forest around the bases. The 2 bases at that time had A-10s primarily. I think it was like the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing or Squadron or something. There was many, many A-10s. When I first got there, some of the guys were living in the barracks, and they had this big box kite they were flying and it got really high, and somebody from the control tower came over and said, "You got to take that thing down. It's too high. It's going to in the pattern, close to the pattern." So, I mean, it was a small place, small tight place. But yeah, Woodbridge was right there with Rendlesham Forest around it. We had a bomb dump. Our drop zone, our land drop zone, was right next to the bomb dump. And I know a couple of times, due to the winds or whatever, there were a couple of our guys that landed inside the bomb dump, which was always up to an hour or so to go through the procedures for the security
UXOs and
get them out of there.
Mm.
But so it was a very tight drop zone. And that was, at that time, we were just jumping around canopies. So it was always interesting jumping there. I think they had, I don't know what all they had inside the bomb dump there, but there are rumors that have come out later that possibly.
Yeah, that was my next question. Yeah, that was my next question.
Yeah.
Did they have B-61s back then? I think that the nuclear gravity bombs.
I don't know. All the protests were going on at other bases in the UK. Greenham Common was a big one with protests. So I think it was very low key that things were kept at other bases and just was never mentioned, and probably part of the reason. So for the UFO.
Well, the same thing is rumored to have happened in the past, late 2024, and probably I think still to this day it's still happening. But Lakenheath and Mildenhall, Feltwell, there's another one that I'm misremembering, that there are rumors that, and there were 2 news articles that I've been able to find that mentioned it, but they're very obscure, that we had moved these B-61-12 nuclear gravity bombs there, which 50 kiloton yield, which is more than 3 times Nagasaki and, Hiroshima each separately. But that's when they first showed up.
Yeah, no idea about what they had in there with those type weapons.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
Yeah. So, okay. So your first assignment is in Bentwater. Woodbridge. I keep saying Bentwaters.
Woodbridge.
My apologies.
Woodbridge, Bentwaters. I got there in February of 1980.
Which is when the Rendlesham Forest incident happened.
In December.
Well, December that year, yeah.
Yeah, December. Now, there were a couple other incidents prior to Rendlesham Forest that really never made very much news at all, but there were a couple, and then I know one person I met later on, she was a security forces there, and she talks about an incident around near the bomb dump, not in the bomb dump, but along the flight line area with something that she saw, which is another story. But there were other things that happened, but prior to the big event well-known event that everybody is aware of.
Did you know Sergeant Peniston at all?
No, I didn't know him. He might have given me a speeding ticket. I didn't know it. I know I got one of them or different areas. But, our paths certainly could have crossed then at some time, but I didn't know him.
What about Colonel Holt?
Oh, no, I didn't know him.
Okay.
I'm an airman. I'm an airman, a A1C. I'm in my little world, a new pararescue man, and my focus is not much past what my periphery is to do my job in the group I'm with. So which kept me really busy. We were, temporary training, TDY, in a lot of areas. We rotated weekly. Crew would rotate weekly to Iceland to pull alerts up there with the detachment there. And then our other training around Europe and England, Scotland. Our area of coverage was pole to pole, mid-Atlantic to Burma.
What?
That was our area of coverage. And we traveled extensively.
Lots of live missions too?
There were some, not a lot, but there were some.
What was the hairiest? I mean, if it's not classified, what was the hairiest mission that you had in those days?
I don't know, say a hairiest mission. Training was always, we didn't simulate training, whether, like if you're doing a night jump in the North Sea, while I was there, we did have one pararescue drown in the North Sea. So that was Mark Crawford. That was, on a regular training jump. So certainly, especially at nighttime, full scuba gear, that was always hairy to me. Our climbing training was hairy. We did have some extended missions that, nothing wasn't over in combat or anything, but there were some missions that we would fly for extended periods of time to support other missions that were ongoing, that we would be there if they were real world missions that they were doing. And we would fly, like I said, when I say extended periods of time, I'm talking 2 days plus. You put 2 crews on board and you have internal fuel tanks that you can fly for 2 days, limited only by crews. One crew would sleep, one crew would fly. I don't know, they're all, in a way, they're all hairy like that, but.
Did you have any like missions that were across the Iron Curtain where you had to rescue somebody who crashed or?
No.
Okay.
There were a couple of times with crashes that we went to secure, first on scene, securing it and recovering. And those are always memories that you don't forget. Well, not so much of a hairy thing, but it's
traumatic.
Yeah, I think a little bit there. I don't want to go into the details of that, but
I have friends who served in GWAT who would have to pick up their buddies after suicide bombing, like that sort of thing. So yeah, we don't have to go there. Yeah.
For me, it was what I wanted to do. We all wanted to be there, and the excitement of it, the thrill of it. We didn't look at it as a hairy. We wanted to do it.
So you were at Woodbridge. What was next? What was your next adventure assignment?
So Woodbridge, I left there, and I went to Kirtland and an instructor billet. And I was there for about a year and a half, and I volunteered for a joint assignment there in JSOC at North Carolina. And the team, when I got there, we were Detachment 4, Numbered Air Force Combat Operations Squadron, which was made up of combat controllers, primarily combat controllers at the time. So as PJs coming in there, it was very low numbers. John Pagini was the first guy in there, and then Emilio Hasso. And then myself and 2 other PJs came in, Larry and Al. And so that really was the beginning of our joint special tactics team. It grew from there. Colonel Carney, combat controller, his vision was to build a special tactics teams. And that's eventually what happened. You can see that what that grew into, and the 2-4 and the other special tactics teams around, whether in the States or overseas. I know later I went to 321st Special Tactics Team in England, and then back to at Hurlburt Field, the Special Tactics Team there.
What was the remit of the Special Tactics Team? It was just pararescue, or was it other missions?
When you say remit, I know what you mean. Special Tactics Teams combined the combat controllers and the pararescuemen together.
Okay.
So it was a joint work,
So it's like if you're rescuing a pilot in a hot zone, you have a combat controller that can drop steel on target to protect you.
Exactly. And you can, a great example of that would be in Serbia, when we had the rescue there of eventually General Goldfein, and the helicopters that came in for the rescue, and a helicopter that was able to land there had 2 PJs and a combat controller on board that were, they got off and made contact with the pilot, General Goldfein. I don't know if what his rank was at the time. I forgot. So that was pretty much the mix there. And then in other teams, you're linked up. Other teams at other units that you would support and attach to. It wasn't always an Air Force element. You may attach to an Army team or a Navy team in the joint world.
So which other units? So if you attach to a Navy team, I'm assuming SEALs. What about an Army team? It could be either Special Forces, so i.e. Green Berets, or you ever work with CAG, the Delta, basically?
We trained together.
Okay. All right. So you're in North Carolina you're working with JSOC. This is circa 1980
84,
something.
85,
Okay.
84, 85.
So this is before JSOC became kind of the massive organization it did after 9/11. These are early days, right?
Yeah, it was much smaller.
Okay, so 1984, you're working JSOC with Special Tactics, right? I'm trying not to butcher this. And then what?
I was there until 89. In that time period, 87 is when I had the parachuting accident and the near-death experience. 18 months.
Let's talk about that specifically. Like what happened on that day?
So I was at Dam Neck, and we're going to do a parachute jump. We went out and we were doing a free fall. So the plan was to free fall from 13,000 feet and open our canopies, deploy our. Most of the guys had a shoulder mount, so I go like this because I'm pulling rather than something that you're pulling from the back. Right. At that time, it was here. Plan was to deploy the canopies at 3,500 feet. So we had several groups. We were rotating. Everybody couldn't fit on the helicopter and together, so we had different groups that would go up and rotate. Myself and another pararescue man, and there was the Navy had a corpsman there. Mike was there, and so Larry and I. We were doing the primary medical coverage, and we would rotate. Larry's on the ground, I would jump, or he would jump, and I was on the ground. And we do these rotations with a Marine CH-46. And on my particular jump, like I said, I talked about my memory of it is in two parts, a conscious part and an unconscious part. My conscious part is preparing for it, driving to the drop zone, in the morning, getting our gear, getting our coffee and our donuts and stuff from the 7-Elevens on the way there. And then the helicopters lands and we're gearing up and we've got our plans and being on board in the air and kind of looking out the window as best just looking out. I'm not with the jump master, so I can't see off the end of the ramp. I look out the window, and then my conscious memory stops there until several days later in ICU. And I'm coming to an ICU and I can't see, I can't move. My face is shut. My eyes are swelling. I can't see and I can't move. I got a brace around my neck and I've got tubes in my mouth, my nose, everywhere. And I remember I wrote.
By the way, I've seen the picture. Like, it doesn't look anything like you. I mean, it was, you know what I mean? You were. Yeah. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt. Keep going.
No, my hair. It said my hair was very light colored from the sun there, more lighter than it is now. It's got more gray now, but so it was so dark from all the blood. But so I remember I wrote two questions. My good friend was there, another person named Mike. He put a pen in my hand and I scribbled, and I still have these notes. I scribbled out, "Am I blind?" And the doctor forced my eyes open and shined a light in each one and said, "Can you see that?" And yeah. And I wrote, "Am I paralyzed? My neck broke." And he said, "No," although there were some breaks or some fractures, but I wasn't paralyzed. And then it was like, when he said no, a complete calm came over me then. It was like, okay, But I was worried if I had either of those conditions, I wouldn't be able to go back and do my job. And I was worried about being able to go back and do my job. And I thought, and right then a complete calm came over me because I thought, well, I'm going to recover from this one day and I'm going to do my job again. And then I went back to sleepy land because of, I was on a morphine drip and all the other drugs that they were giving me. And then that went on all my recovery over the next 18 months.
What did you have to do during that recovery, by the way? Because I couldn't have. Well, first of all, how far did you fall? Because I think this is important.
Okay, so we opened up our canopies as planned at 3,500 feet, and with you're free falling, so you come in, you open your canopy, you go back to that position real quick. Your canopy opens within a couple of seconds, and at that point, there was another jumper still above me in free fall. You're falling at 120 miles an hour. He saw my chute. He balled up in a cannonball position instinctively. He's protecting himself. And that,
which would cause him to accelerate because the momentum.
And so that collision destroyed my parachute, shattered my skull, and knocked me unconscious. So I streamered with that. A couple of cells remained open, and I streamered in a controllable violent spin, unconscious for about 3,000 feet. They estimate 100 miles an hour hitting the ground. I don't remember any of that. That's in my unconscious world. Although at that point, my soul, my consciousness was leaving my body. I can see Bobby and Dave on the ground next to me. They were two of the SEALs that saw me in the air and knew I was in trouble, steered their canopies to land as near to where I was as they could. They were the first ones to get to me. And Bobby said I was in a convulsion. He rolled me over. He said like a gallon of blood poured out of my mouth. They were like, they're not medics. They're shooters. They're like, they're.
But they are trained. They do have basic training.
And the day prior, we'd had some medical training that I had provided on stopping bleeding and opening airways. So we cross-train each other, and that was something I did the day prior. So I know Dave, he was talking about putting a hole in my throat because we talked about cricothyroidotomies. And he's like, he has this knife about this big, and he's like, oh, man, this is... So he did cross his mind, and he didn't do it. And shortly thereafter, I don't know how long it was, the guys are starting to come in there, and the medic was about a mile away. Larry, he was about a mile away, the PJ. So they got there, and they built a makeshift litter. The helicopter it was running out of gas. It had to leave, and it didn't have a hoist capability. And it was it was several hundred yards away from an area where it could have landed. But in that time period, I could say, okay, I'm not aware that I'm injured as a conscious person. Oh, that hurts. I'm injured. I stubbed my toe or hit my finger with a hammer, whatever it may be. I know I'm hurt. But in this instance, I was leaving my body, my consciousness. And it's kind of a funny feeling because even though I see my body and my consciousness, my soul is leaving, it feels like I'm still encapsulated in a body. I think there's a transition period for that. I can see the guys on the ground with me. And also I'm completely surrounded in a light. I describe it as a 40-watt light of embracing me. And it's energy, it's love. And it's the most peaceful, loving feeling I've ever had. And over this area, higher point, even though it feels like it's over my shoulder, it's there. It's a very, very bright area, like the sunlight, or 100-watt light bulb instead of that 40 in it. But in it, I see three figures, and they're hovering there, standing there, however they are. They're in this light, and I know we are communicating, and they are there for me, and I'm going to them. My consciousness is going, and I'm getting closer and closer. And it's just a wonderful feeling. And I know that I'm going to see who it is any second. And then I hear a voice that tells me it's time to go now. And I said, God, I'm not ready to go yet. And I kind of feel like I turned away from the light. And then at that point, I had a lot of feelings, a lot of thoughts of events, and the lessons poured into me about how to be the person. And then that was the last thing I remember at that point. And then I woke up in ICU.
When you heard it's time to go now, was that it's time to leave your body forever, or was it it's time to go back to your body?
I interpreted that it's time to go now as I am leaving this realm, earth, body. The body's down there, it's crumpled, it's broken, but I am leaving, I am going with them. Wherever that may be, they are there to meet me, and I'm going with them.
And then you turned and came back instead.
And, that's one of the things, the lessons there is choice. We are who we are by the choices we make. I got to talk to people. I said, I'm sitting here talking to you based on the millions of choices I've made in my life that have gotten me to this point. So we have choices. Our choices make us who we are.
Did you have a sense of who these three or what these three beings were?
I felt they were relatives.
Okay.
But that is not 100% confirmed. I just thought it was some connection as a relative, being in grandparents and that realm. Mother, father, grandparents, both of my parents have passed. So I just...
Do you recall having like a knowing, like you knew infinitely more than what you currently know when you're kind of embodied when you were in that state? Or again, too hazy to remember?
It was just such a peaceful, loving, embracing feeling. The embodied feeling was that we are all connected. The energy that we have we're all connected. It doesn't matter who we are, male, female, race, color, that we're all connected. It's through the energy.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll come back to this a little bit more in the next episode, but I couldn't let it go. I thought it would be interesting to talk about. All right. So you're in the hospital. You have an 18-month recovery ahead of you, and one in which it wasn't clear that you'd be able to go back and be a PJ.
No,
right.
It was not clear.
So just very briefly, talk me through that process. Like where it started, like kind of what they told you the expectations were, and then where it ended.
So I guess I really wasn't giving it much thought in the early parts in the hospital. I'm healing. The accident was on February 4th. And then 13 days later was my first surgery. Or I don't know how many days later. The 13th of February was my first major surgery where they reconstructed everything. So when I got to the emergency room, they immediately put an airway in a crike. I would call it a cricothyroidotomy. Although we're trained to do that, and the guys could have done it to me in the field, they chose not to. I had a palate that was split, and it would stop the bleeding with gauze into my throat, into my palate, the open area, and then it would fill with blood, and I'd take it out, and I was having difficulty breathing the whole time. But they didn't do a crike at that point. The doctors did it in the ER. And so I had that crike until after the first surgery. And that was about a 12-hour surgery with the realignment of the bones, the facial bones, jaws, chin, forehead, everything that they did, the screws, the plates, the internal fixations that they used to, you say the internal fixations are just like put a cast externally on a bone to heal it. Inside, you use plates and screws and wires to fix things in place. So that was for surgery. I remember they used a picture of what I looked like to align what they could. There's some, it's almost close. It's different. It is different.
Oh my God.
But I had a picture. They wanted to see what I look like. And well, a few days after that, I believe that the tube was removed from my throat. The tube is a cannula, was removed. Heals up, your skin heals up very fast in that, in the cricothyroid space. And then about a week later, things weren't lining up right. So I went back in for a second major reconstruction surgery. And they had to, so I was wired shut at that time. Everything was wired. So they recut over the cricothyroid space and inserted. But for surgery, it was like a jet tube of oxygen or air that they were pushing in. When I came out of the surgery, I had another cannula in that space, and that remained in place for another couple of weeks, and they took it out. And I stayed at Portsmouth Naval Hospital for about 3 months, covering it until I went back to Fort Bragg and Fort Bragg Pope. And then my body, I was hurt, I was injured, nothing was broken, or I couldn't walk or run. So it was right about that time I started having difficulty breathing again. What happened was where the tubes and the cuts were in my throat had caused an irritation to where they call it a subglottic granuloma. Medical terms, was just a mass, was growing in my throat and blocking my airway. And so I was sent back up to Portsmouth. They went in with a laser and they lasered it out. And a couple of weeks later, it was back. And then I went a couple of times, they did that. And then they said, hey, this thing is coming back so big and so fast. For your protection, you may come out of the next one with a tracheotomy. And I was physically tired of breathing because it was closing my airway. So I'm using my external muscles to breathe. And I was afraid when I would go to sleep at night, I might not wake up because, it's hard to breathe. So I did. I came out of that after about the third time with a tracheotomy. And then this continued on for several more months of going in and lasering out that growth. And then finally it was to the point they said, hey, we're going to have to reconstruct your throat. This thing is coming back. That's our next step, is going to be to reconstruct your trachea. And the surgeon was telling me this, and they'd done a few other things, sending me around to other specialists. He told me, he said, on this hand, I'm a board certified surgeon. I can do it. On this hand, you're going to be my first patient. I haven't ever done it. And I probably looked at him with really big eyes. And then he said, if it was me, I would want somebody to do this that had done it before, because you're going to be living with this for the rest of your life. I said, thank you. Who do you suggest? And he had told me Dr. William Montgomery, who was a leading surgeon in this field at Mass General. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go to see Dr. Montgomery at Mass General, and he did reconstruct my throat a little differently than what they had planned on doing it. But so he split my trachea down the middle on the midline, anterior and posteriorly. So he, just like if you imagine a garden hose, and he opened it up like this way, and then he grafted cartilage in on both sides, put another tube in. And the tube was one that would go straight in and turn up and down at 90-degree angles. And it would expand to hold the trachea open as it healed, just as you put a cast on a broken arm. You're holding it in place so it will heal. Same thing from the inside to hold it open. And about 4 or 5 months later, he took it out. We talked, and he said, I did the best I could. Your trachea is almost 80% diameter of what it should be. It won't ever get any better than that. And that's the best I can do. And so at that point, I knew.
So basically, you had 80% of the throughput that you used to have for your lungs, basically.
Yeah, that's what I have now. And from that point, I went straight back to base. I had to do a couple things. I had to submit a request for a waiver to the Surgeon General of the Air Force. And I also had to take a physical fitness requalification test. And I was able to pass the test. And lucky and fortunate, I got a waiver from the Surgeon General, and which is amazing, a miracle in itself because of my head injury and being unconscious. That doesn't align with being on flying status and jump status. And once I had that paper in my hand, we scheduled a jump. And about a week later, I was jumping out of a C-130. And I was in the system, so I was good to go.
How did you get back up with PT? How long did you have to? Did you just go in and take a PT test without?
Well, in that time period, the only thing I really couldn't do was swim because I had a hole in my throat through that tube. So if I would have jumped in the water, I would have filled up with water through that hole. But I could run, and I wasn't out there, blazing speeds, but I could get out there and I could exercise and lift weights and run the best I could. So I continued doing that all the way through the recovery. And I still do it, it's never stopped. It's pretty much a way of life. So it's harder to stop than it is to maintain it.
Oh, really?
I think so. I don't want to stop.
Yeah.
It would be easy. In a way, it would be easy to physically stop working out or exercising. But psychologically, it would bother me too much to stop doing it.
Yeah. Well, that's a good psychological problem to have.
Who's going to be in charge? Is my body going to be in charge, or is my mind going to be in charge? And there's a battle there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. All right. So 18-month recovery. You're back in the PJs. Then what?
So the first 2 jumps back were really, really interesting, really kind of scary. That first one was really scary, jumping in. So I stayed there at the unit for another year and a half after that. I got 87, 88. I ended up leaving in 89. Had some good training. We got a great rock climbing trip in Yosemite. We climbed Lost Arrow with my group of guys. Was phenomenal, fun. And some other climbs in that area around Yosemite, Half Dome and El Cap. I didn't summit El Cap, climbing, several pitches on it. It was fun. And when I left there, I went back to Kirtland. I had a connection to Kirtland, ex-wife, and went back to Kirtland as an instructor. I was there for, only about a year and a half. It was during that time period when I met David. I volunteered to teach a Civil Air Patrol course in the summer. And David happened to be in a Civil Air Patrol cadet in one of the courses. And that's how we met, which was, I wasn't like a real sadistic person. I was going to do my exercises every day, regardless of where I was. And I had the opportunity to lead the cadets in morning PT. So I hit them with my routine for about, 45 minutes and then a run. And they had a tough time keeping up on anything, they probably never done a flutter kick before in their life. So if I hit them with 100 flutter kicks, they're all. But David, David.
I still have memories about that. Next exercise will be the flutter kick, right?
Yeah. Assume the position.
Yep.
So David liked the challenge. and he wanted to be challenged by it more. And that's when he sought me out about a year and a half later. He had decided he wanted to join the Air Force and go into pararescue. And that's when he did find me. After I went back after the Civil Air Patrol course, I went back to Kirtland as some of my instructor duties, and then a new opportunity arose, and that was to be a instructor at the Army Special Forces Scuba School in Key West, Florida, because we always sent our students, our combat control and pararescue students, through the scuba school there, and the Air Force would, transfer funds to the Army for those courses. And the Army always wanted additional instructors, and the Air Force, we were always short on bodies. But finally, they had come to the point where they were going to allocate several instructor and positions of Air Force down there. And so I volunteered for it. The Chief Stanley called me, asked me if I wanted to do it. I said, of course I want to do it. I grew up in Florida. I want to go back to Florida. Mm-hmm. So volunteered for it, was selected for it, went to Key West as an instructor there for 3 years. It was amazing. Loved it. We'll go back in a heartbeat. And then from there, I was there 3 years. Then that same chief called and asked me if I would go to England at the 321st Special Tactics team in England. And so I went back. I went to England, left Key West and went to England, and was there from 95 to 99. Spent the majority of that time was our rotations for Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia, what was going on there in former Yugoslavia. And then I went from there to Hurlburt Field, Florida, Special Tactics team there. And then I retired out of there in 2002.
Talk a little bit about, I think you had a rescue operation in Serbia. It was Serbia. Well, I can't remember if we talked about this on the call or if we talked about it prior to the interview. But we rescued a future general.
Well, I wasn't on the rescue, but that was, part of the team that I was with. So we had our alert cycles, and we had the teams there. We had MH-53s and H-60s, and had the quick reaction forces. And so we would keep them on an alert posture. During that rescue, I was actually tasked flying with the Army. I think it was called Task Force Hawk, on other missions that were going on, and I was flying with them. And that particular night, we were in the air flying, and we heard a call over the radio that a U.S. F-16 had just been shot down. Certainly, hey, we're ready to attempt a rescue if needed, if we're in the area and can do it. But, the pilot's position was not exactly known, and we were a little bit out of that spot where he was shot down. So when they did locate him, a couple hours later, the alert team launched in, and that package landed and was able to pick him up and get out of there. Yeah, a couple of months prior to that, the F-117 was shot down, and that was my other team that had rotated down there. I wasn't down there on that one. So there was a couple of missions that were quite hairy for them.
Yeah, I'm not going to say on this podcast, but when I was in the Army, an Army air defense team just told me exactly, matter-of-factly, how it was shot down. And then I spoke to a friend.
The F-17 or the 16? Yeah.
The F-117. I'm not going to repeat it because I subsequently spoke to a friend who, in business school, he was a stealth bomber pilot. And I just matter-of-factly told him how it was shot down. He's just like, that's classified. You can't. I'm like, well, the guy who told me he just matter-of-factly told me what it was. So I'm not going to repeat it because of, apparently the Air Force thinks it's classified. The Army doesn't.
Yeah. The pilot came out to Kirtland and briefed everybody on that mission. And it was, it happened. So,
All right. So going back to where before I interrupted you and brought you back to Serbia and all that good stuff, you were back in the U.S. What was your next assignment?
was at Hurlburt Field.
Yep.
20, I can't even think of which one it was. A special tactics team there. I was the operations officer there. Getting old. I can't remember which unit I was in there, but that was
Well, they keep changing too.
21st, I think. No, that was a Pope. Terrible.
23rd?
23rd Special Tactics Squadron. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. So I was there until I was medically retired and stayed there in the area working for Northrop Grumman. They had a contract for instructor positions there on the base on Hurlburt, teaching Air Operations Center, simulate a big Air Operations Center, and bring in, members from all the branches of the service that would find themselves basically in a wartime environment. And kind of like, if you were playing chess, right? You're there, you got all the pieces and you're moving them around, you know where everybody is. So the Air Operations Center takes overall take a look at picture and where all the units are. So you don't have fratricide, or you're overlapping missions and know who's doing what. So they teach that area and they have missions they would run in there, simulated missions. And I was in there with the search and rescue unit that's in there. Combat search and rescue would have a desk in there. And if somebody got shot down, they're making the liaison connections between the units that are there and getting the information of, you want to get the crew members, they've got their information on file so you can verify who it is when you go into rescue and make sure it's not a SAR trap that you're coming into. And I did that for a little over a year, I guess, and then moved to Minnesota. My wife was from Minnesota, wanted to move to Minnesota. So man, there's the beach over there. It gets cold up there, right? So, but anyway, gave in and we moved up here. And then I went into culture shock, looking at chlorine growing faster than me, and ended up from there. I stayed up here a couple of years and then got hired on with Triple Canopy, providing security in different areas for them, primarily in Iraq.
Oh, wow. So after you retired, I mean, how many years had you spent in the Air Force before?
22.
So after 22 years in the Air Force, you went back basically into Iraq. And like, what kind of missions did you do there? Like force protection, not force protection, but
my
like
first year I did fixed site security, where the embassy was, and you have the green zone, and to get into the green zone, you'd have checkpoints. And I was a team leader at one of the checkpoints coming in. I think it was 16 or 13. It was a very busy checkpoint. We had a green zone, and then you had the layer of security for us. Then you had Iraqis a little bit outer from us as well, and check vehicles and personnel. And there we had my crew that I managed was primarily Peruvian guards that were contracted by the same company. So I think Triple Canopy behind the Air Force, had the second largest armed military in the country at that time, with as many people as they had, and big site security in different areas. And they were really good. They, mostly ex-military and law enforcement. And it was pretty well, you get the Peruvians who speak Spanish. They picked up, Iraqi quickly. So now they're teaching me how to speak Iraqi and Spanish. So it's always a little bit of languages jumbled in there. So I did that for a year, and then I switched over to the mobile security side and primarily did that part of it for, diplomatic protection services.
Lots of IED stuff that you had to deal with, and
then so my project manager left a couple years later and went to Papua, Indonesia, and he was heading a project there. And then I got a call from one of the other guys who was with him about a year later and asked me if I wanted to come over to Indonesia. And so I said, sure, I want to do that. So I switched out of Iraq and went to Indonesia for a couple of years.
how was that?
You know, it was an interesting assignment there where we were providing security for the gold mine, McMoran copper and gold mine. And that, if you can Google that and see the mine, it is massive on the top of the mountain. So there's roads, there's a main road, one main road up to it and down to it.
What's the name of the mine again?
McMoran.
McMoran. Okay.
Gold and copper mine. I think mostly copper now, but it is huge. And so we would patrol the pipeline and we worked with their BREMOB, which is a special police and the army, their army, and they would jointly, we'd be part of a joint team. And since it was an area that was congested often, sometimes I would say the Papuan revolutionary side, I don't remember what they called them there, but they would attack the workers as we would escort them up and down the mountain. I was driving one day out of the jungle and got for the bulletproof glass because there was a shot right in front of my head on the glass, and it was amazing. So,
Did you get in any firefights through any of this stuff?
No, I didn't get any firefights. I know there were several vehicles that did get hit a few times, but it wasn't an everyday event.
And this is still Triple Canopy that you're working for at the time?
It was Triple Canopy. I know there was another company liaison between Triple Canopy to there. Remember the name of them.
And then, so you do kind of this Indonesian security for several years, 2 years?
2.5 years or so, yeah. Then came back and I was taking a bit of a break. It was really, our rotations were generally about 3 months in, 1 month out, and I had scheduled a 2-month break for a year in advance because my son was getting married, and then they were like, no, you got to come back. And I said, well, I can't come back. My son planned his marriage around my break, which I've had in the book. So I said, oh, I hate to do it, but I'm not going to come back then. And so I didn't go back. And then I ran into one of my buddies at a Pararescue reunion shortly thereafter. I said, hey, what are you doing? And I told him, I said, well, I don't know. I'm kind of taking some time off. He said, well, here's a job you might be interested in, which he was involved with. It was the one with Homeland Security. So he told me about it, and I said, hey, that sounds like a good job. It's a home-based job, because the facilities I go to on a regular basis, those aren't my office. So pretty much all I needed was a computer, a laptop, and I could do that job anywhere. And so I said, yeah, that sounds great. I'll work out of my home. I'll be just going out and about to inspect the facilities, come back, write the report. And so I did that for 7 years.
And now you're retired, full stop, or?
Full stop. I did a little contract work last year for the Air Force at San Antonio at the indoctrination course for combat control and pararescue. And then the contract got changed a little bit, so they didn't need as many guys. So, now I'm more of a retired role. I do a little bit of speaking. It's just like this. It's just like I guess the motivational side of it is, you get knocked down, you get back up again. You don't quit. You might pause for a while, but you never fully quit. Might pause, get a reset.
Well, for that, if somebody wants to hire you for public speaking, where should they go and how do they set it up?
my website was the best place. scottgearen.com is the best place to contact me through that.
All right. Any final advice for the audience?
That's always the hardest part of it, giving advice, right? Say, just like in my near-death experience, we're all connected. So be nice to each other.
All right, Scott. It was an absolute pleasure. And we'll get into these anomalous experiences, or hopefully most of them, if not all of them, in the next episode. So thank you again.
All right. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.